I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more while you're reading this first slide. It's titled First Principles for a reason. I grew up trained to be a physicist originally. In my very first college physics class, the professor, and I remember his name, Robert Drummond, asked me what would happen if a ball 1,000th the size of another ball, but was rapidly moving, collided with that 1,000 times bigger ball. What would happen? Just give me a qualitative answer. And I gave him what I thought was a really clever qualitative answer. And he shook his head and said, because that ball is moving so fast, it's actually going to move the ball that's 1,000 times bigger than this tiny thing that's moving very fast. When you answer or look at a problem in physics, you should always go back to first principles. In this case, it was Newton's third law, as I remember correctly. And that's stuck with me ever since. Whenever I'm faced with a new challenge or a new problem, what are the first principles? Here is a list taken from various libraries' websites of the first principles that I think apply in the case of born digital newspapers or historical newspapers. You can see, you can read for yourself. I'm not going to read them to you. Singapore's is actually quite interesting to make a more gracious society. I'm going to start by talking about historical newspapers, the digitization of historical newspapers. As I think many of you are aware, historical newspapers are generally digitized from an image scanned from either microfilm or paper to some image format. There are OCR'd and quite a lot of metadata is added. This is common to all newspaper digitization projects, either commercial or public, National Library or State Library or any other library. The metadata used is Metz Alto, as Nick Townend mentioned, for the British Library. Non-libraries typically do the same sorts of things, they just preserve it in different file formats. What do we mean by born digital newspapers? At least for what I'm going to talk about, born digital just means the newspapers usually in PDF files that are sent to the printers. It does not mean the news from websites. So if you're going to capture PDF files and do something with them, as many libraries are beginning to realize they must do, what does this mean for deposit? What does it mean for copyright? And so forth. You'll see here a list of countries that are revising their laws on legal deposit in order to accommodate born digital content. Specifically, I'm talking about newspapers. You'll see France has been doing this for quite some time, but they haven't done anything with the content. Finland is actually doing a pilot project with its publishers, with its newspaper publishers as well as other publishers, and presenting that born digital content in cooperation with their copyright society. Singapore, likewise, by mandate of the government, is cooperating with the Singapore National Library, is cooperating with their two biggest publishing houses, Singapore Press House and Media Corp, to capture their born digital content, preserve it, and make it accessible to the public. I'll come back to all of those in a little bit. Here in this country, University of Kentucky has been capturing born digital newspapers from at least smaller publishers in collaboration with the Kentucky Press Association. University of California is working individually with publishers to capture some of the born digital content that would otherwise be lost, and has actually presented some of it on its website. And the University of Florida has been doing this for far longer than either of those other two, but I don't know much about it, so I'm not going to say anything more about it. So what are the reasons for capturing born digital rather than capturing from paper? here you can see the relative costs, and don't take these as gospel. This is just a cost range. Cost is certainly one of the factors in wanting to capture born digital content rather than capturing from paper or microfilm. As you can see, if you look just at the very last line, not the total, but the very last line, the data production, actually taking the data files and presenting it, preserving it, or adding metadata and presenting it on your website is a whole lot cheaper than doing it from paper or microfilm. Another reason is quality. A born digital file usually has all the text that you're going to need. You don't have to go through an OCR step. There are some problems with PDF files. There are a number of problems with PDF files, actually, but one of them is not text accuracy. And then the last is speed, which is pretty obvious. If you can take a digital file and simply FTP it to somebody's website, access site, or access point, or preservation point, it's a whole lot faster than going through the whole thing of taking paper, taking a picture, putting it on microfilm, OCRing it, adding metadata, and so forth. One of the difficulties with PDFs, most news publishers use PDF files to drive printing presses and not for much else. The PDF files are fine for driving printing presses. The PDF file is essentially a replica of the printed page. Many of you may have heard about a PDF version called PDF-A, which stands for PDF Archival. It's actually an ISO standard now. None of the newspaper publishers bother with PDF-A files, which actually has some metadata in it that make it preservation worthy. In fact, many of the PDF files, even from the same newspaper publishers, once you look at the insides of those PDF files, differ quite widely from each other. So just being able to ingest or capture PDF files doesn't really get you much more than how the printed page looks. So, born digital files, as well as a lot of historical newspapers, they're all still in copyright, regardless of the country you go to, unless you go to Russia, where newspapers are not copyrightable or copyrighted at all. So what about the copyright? If you're going to capture and make accessible born digital newspapers, you have to worry about copyright somehow. So the University of Kentucky is doing it by collaborating with the Kentucky Press Association. Exactly how that's done, besides having each individual publisher sign some agreement with the University of Kentucky, I don't know. The University of California is likewise negotiating individual agreements with some of the smaller publishers. They're not bothering with the big papers because they will not be so amiable to signing away or giving away their content. Finland works with the Finnish Copyright Society. Yes, there are really such things in countries other than America. And Finland will, in order to secure legal access to those newspapers, will go to the Copyright Society to obtain permission from the publishers. The Copyright Society is very much like a copyright broker. In the United Kingdom, and perhaps Nick can speak a bit more to this, they have an equivalent copyright society called the Newspaper Licensing Agency, which if you want to use copyright from, or you want to use content from some copyrighted newspaper, you go to the Newspaper Licensing Agency and pay a fee or obtain permission to use the content, and then you're fine with it. The access control on these born digital images varies from place to place, and I'll come back to that in a little bit. Now if we look at, well, let me say a word about the Singapore National Library. They have taken it on themselves to capture the news content, the newspapers from the beginning of Singapore, which is 1830-something, all the way up to the present day, including copyrighted content. And they also have decided to make that copyrighted content, as well as the historical content, accessible to the public with some limitations. Just recently, None of this was available on the internet at all, but it was available at certain media stations, what they call media stations within the Singapore library system. Last February, Singapore announced that all content prior to 1990 is searchable and viewable from any place on the internet. Anything after 1990 is searchable from any place. You have to go into the library itself to view any of it. Now come back to this problem. You've got a single page from the Straits Times, which is the flagship newspaper in Singapore and Southeast Asia as well. There are 3 different types of content, at least with respect to copyright on this page. You'll see an article from a staff writer at the Singapore Press House, one from some independent, and 2 from news services. So if you're going to present these things on the internet, make them accessible to anyone, how do you deal with 3 different, and article-wise, not page-wise, how do you deal with the 3 different types of articles? Part of the METS file, you heard that earlier from Nick as well, part of the METS file has an access condition embedded into it, a different access condition for each type of content, plus yet another one for the entire issue itself. Those access conditions allow the delivery software that Singapore uses to govern who gets to see which article and where they get to see it. This is just a very high-level block diagram of how the delivery system works. You'll see the delivery system itself on your left, the image server software, digital library software. A separate software module is actually what the delivery system queries in order to find out whether that person at this IP address or with this identity can look at this particular article. If you attempt to look at a wire service article prior to 1990, outside of the Singapore library premises, your access is denied. Using the access policy, using these access policies. If you look at an article from the Singapore Press House from anywhere on the internet, prior to 1990, you're fine. If you try to look at any content post-1990, then the access is denied. And how this works, basically, is each of these articles has what is called an X-link that points to an access policy that's maintained by that access policy enforcement software, and it does so in the following way. That's just like an HTTP server. And this is a handle that's unique to Singapore National Library, assigned by the Digital Object Federation, and this is the access policy itself that governs access to that particular article. And here you see at least you see mostly, I see a bit of it's cut off at the bottom, how this works. So that's how Singapore deals with copyright. Most Finland, who will also publish and make accessible copyrighted newspapers, has decided, at least during its pilot phase, to make copyrighted stuff only accessible from within the library or affiliated libraries, research and university libraries.